The night was calm at the coastal base. The sea stretched endlessly, reflecting the faint glow of the moon. The air was cool and still, the kind that made everything feel peaceful and lonely at the same time. Inside the communication room, a young officer named Elliot sat in front of the radar screen. The green light swept slowly in a circle, showing nothing but empty space. He rubbed his eyes and yawned, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was past midnight, the quietest time of the shift. Elliot wasn't new to long nights like this. Most of the time, there was nothing to report, just the soft hum of the machines and the steady rhythm of the radar. But that night felt different. There was something about the silence that didn't sit right with him. He couldn't explain it, but he had that strange feeling people get before something big happens. He leaned closer to his screen, scanning the radar one more time. Everything looked normal. He sipped cold coffee from a chipped mug and stared at the faint waves outside through the small window. The sea was dark, but it wasn't calm. He could tell by the movement of the water that something was out there, even though the radar said otherwise. Then, out of nowhere, his headset crackled. A faint sound came through, broken and distorted. It wasn't the usual static. It sounded like a voice. He turned a few knobs, trying to clear the signal. For a moment, it went silent again. Then the voice returned, weak, trembling, almost lost in the noise. "SOS, this is Unit. They're coming. Fleet. Deathworlder fleet. Repeat, the Deathworlder fleet is on the march." Elliot froze. He turned the volume up and pressed record. The voice repeated the same message again, then cut off. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving behind only static. He played it again, listening carefully. The words didn't make much sense, but the fear in that voice was unmistakable. Whoever sent it was terrified. He quickly checked the signal coordinates. It came from somewhere near an old island post about 100 kilometers away. That post wasn't active anymore. It had been shut down months ago. He frowned. How could a dead station send an SOS? He called out to his superior officer, who was half asleep in the control booth next door. The man walked in, rubbing his eyes, clearly not interested in whatever Elliot had found. Elliot replayed the recording for him. The officer listened for a few seconds, then shook his head. "It's probably an old distress loop," he said. "Might be leftover from when that post was shut down. You know these systems sometimes replay old signals when weather messes with the frequency." "But sir," Elliot said, "the voice sounds fresh. And the message, it's like someone's warning us." The officer sighed. "Elliot, it's 2 a.m. No one's invading us. Write the report, log the timestamp, and go back to your station. We'll check it in the morning." He left without another word. Elliot sat there for a moment, listening to the empty static. But then, just as he was about to turn off the frequency, the signal came again. Louder this time, more broken. "They're close. Please, warn them." Elliot felt his heart race. He leaned forward, his hand shaking slightly as he noted down the new timestamp. He tried to trace the signal's path, but it kept jumping around, as if it was being disrupted. Something about it didn't feel like just bad weather. He sent a message to Central Command, including the audio file, but the system responded automatically. Message received. Low priority. He frowned. It didn't even reach a human operator. Outside, the wind began to pick up. Waves crashed harder against the shore. The sky was darker than usual, heavy clouds rolling in from the east. Elliot stood up and walked out onto the balcony, staring out into the sea. He thought he saw faint lights far in the distance, small, flickering points moving slowly across the horizon. At first, he thought they were fishing boats, but they were too many and they were moving in perfect formation. He blinked, and for a moment the lights were gone. When he came back inside, his colleague at the radar desk called out, "Hey, check this out." The radar had picked up a small cluster of signals on the edge of their range. They were fast and steady, moving directly toward the coast. Elliot leaned over the screen. "That can't be a storm," he said softly. "Those are objects." His colleague shrugged. "Probably another system glitch. The equipment's been acting up all week." Elliot watched as the signals grew stronger. "No," he said. "These are real. Look at the pattern. They're in formation. That's not random." They both stared in silence. A chill ran down Elliot's spine. The faint voice from the SOS echoed in his mind. "They're coming." He picked up the phone again, this time calling a nearby listening post. No one answered. He tried another. Nothing. The lines were still open, but no one responded. That was strange. Communication lines between posts were supposed to stay manned at all times. The night shift felt longer than ever. Every few minutes, the radar picked up faint blips that would appear and vanish. The ocean outside looked darker than usual, as if the horizon itself was swallowing the moonlight. By 3 a.m., everyone in the base was uneasy. A few technicians reported hearing strange static bursts through their headsets. One even said she heard whispering beneath the noise, like someone trying to speak but getting drowned out. Elliot didn't mention the earlier SOS again. He could tell no one wanted to talk about it. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the message wasn't just random. Someone had been out there trying desperately to warn them. Around 3:30, the signal came again. This time it was much clearer, almost shouting. To anyone listening, they're coming from the east. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. The Deathworlder fleet is on the march. Then silence. Elliot stood frozen. His stomach tightened. The radar suddenly went blank for several seconds, then filled with dozens of moving dots. The system began to beep rapidly. His colleagues stared wide-eyed at the screen. What is that? Elliot's hands moved quickly over the console. Multiple contacts, he said, voice shaking. They're moving fast, faster than any ship should. The officer from before ran in, demanding an explanation. Elliot pointed to the screen. The older man stared for a moment, then ordered them to contact command immediately. But the phones were dead. The satellite uplink went dark seconds later. Every system began to flicker. The power lights dimmed, then came back, then dimmed again. The officer frowned, clearly rattled. It's just interference, he said. But his voice betrayed doubt. Interference doesn't move information, Elliot replied quietly. The officer didn't respond. He stared at the radar, watching the unidentified objects getting closer. Keep recording, he said finally. If this is a drill, we'll find out soon enough. But it wasn't a drill. Minutes passed. The blips stopped just offshore. Then just as suddenly as they appeared, they vanished again. The radar went empty. The lights on the panel flickered and returned to normal. Everything seemed fine, too fine. The officer exhaled slowly. Maybe it was a false reading, he said. Let's not jump to conclusions. Elliot didn't answer. He was still staring at the horizon through the window. The sea looked calm again, but there was something off about the air. It smelled faintly like metal, like ozone after lightning. He turned his eyes back to the screen. The radar was clear, but the signal receiver light was still blinking. He adjusted the frequency. At first there was only static. Then faintly, the same trembling voice whispered one last message. They're here. The signal died completely. Elliot sat back in silence, staring at the blinking red light. No one spoke. The hum of the machines filled the room again, but now it sounded different. Heavier somehow, like the air itself was warning them to listen. For the rest of the night, no one left the room. Every minute felt longer than the last. No new signals came through and the radar stayed empty. But the feeling of being watched never went away. When dawn finally broke, the sea looked peaceful again, shining under the soft light of morning. The senior officer filed a report describing the night's events as technical interference and unverified signal anomalies. It sounded official, safe and dismissive. Elliot signed the report quietly, but he knew what he had heard. It wasn't interference. It wasn't a mistake. It was a warning. He went back to the control room and played the recording one more time before archiving it. The faint, broken voice repeated through the static, desperate and final. The Deathworlder fleet is on the march. Elliot sat still for a long time after that, staring out at the calm ocean. For the first time in his life, the silence of the sea didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the world was holding its breath, and deep down, he knew the signal would come again. The next morning came slowly, but the strange feeling from the night before never really faded. The air around the base still carried a strange chill, and even the sound of the waves felt different, heavier, almost tired. Elliot sat at his desk with a cup of cold coffee, staring at the radar screen that had gone blank hours ago. He hadn't slept at all. The voice from the SOS still echoed in his mind. They're coming. Warn them. The senior officers dismissed the incident during the morning briefing. They called it a malfunction caused by atmospheric distortion. The radar was recalibrated, and the strange signals were marked as false readings. But Elliot knew what he had seen and heard. Machines didn't imagine voices. They didn't cry for help. He tried to bring it up again during the meeting, explaining that the SOS came from an abandoned island post. The others just laughed lightly, saying that the old equipment sometimes reactivated by mistake. It's probably just leftover tech-sending noise, one of them said. You've been up too long, that's all. Elliot nodded quietly, but he didn't believe a word of it. When the meeting ended, he walked down to the lower communication bay to check the archived frequencies. He wanted to find the exact path the SOS had taken. After several hours of searching, he finally traced it back to its source, the same island post that had been shut down months ago. That station had no active personnel, no working power lines, and no emergency transmitters left. So how did a dead base send a distress signal? He looked through the old logs. The last entry from that outpost was 6 months old. It mentioned a small team stationed there for maintenance, but the report ended suddenly, without any closure or follow-up. No one had ever reported back. As he read the report, his radio crackled softly again. It wasn't the same SOS, but it was close. Just static this time, broken by faint background noise. It sounded almost like wind and faint movement, as if someone were trying to speak but couldn't. He leaned closer, adjusting the frequency carefully. But after a few seconds, it went silent. Elliot took off his headset and looked around the empty room. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The base had always felt safe, almost boring, but now every sound made him uneasy. That night, the radar team picked up faint disturbances again, tiny blips that moved too fast to be normal aircraft. The senior officer brushed it off once more, calling it weather interference. But Elliot could see the tension growing in everyone's faces. No one said it out loud, but they were all thinking the same thing. What if the message had been real? By the third day, other listening posts along the coast began reporting small communication failures. Some of them lost contact for a few hours, and then came back online without explanation. The official report said temporary power issues, but Elliot knew better. He reached out to one of his friends working at a nearby station, but there was no answer. He tried again and again. Still nothing. The next day, his friend's post went completely silent. No contact, no updates, nothing. Command said the team was probably undergoing maintenance. Elliot didn't believe it. Late that evening, he gathered 2 of his colleagues, men he trusted, and showed them the SOS recording. He told them about the lost island post and the missing signals. They listened carefully, their faces growing pale as the recording played. "Why hasn't Command done anything?" one of them asked quietly. "They don't want panic," Elliot replied. "They think it's safer to say nothing." One of the men suggested they try to locate the signal's path more precisely. Maybe if they could prove it wasn't just random static, the higher-ups would take them seriously. So the 3 of them stayed in the communication room long after their shifts ended, studying the data from every nearby frequency. Hours passed. The air outside grew thick with fog, the sea barely visible through the window. Then, around midnight, the signal came again. But this time it wasn't the same voice. It was a deep, slow transmission, static mixed with a strange humming tone that none of them had heard before. It repeated every few seconds. Elliot's hands trembled slightly as he recorded it. "What is that?" one of the men whispered. "I don't know," Elliot said, "but it's coming from the same region." They marked the coordinates, and what they found made no sense. The signal was coming directly from the ocean, far beyond where any known base or ship should be. For a few moments, no one spoke. The radar showed nothing there, no ships, no weather patterns, just open water. Elliot took a deep breath. "We need to report this." But when they tried to send the data to Central Command, the system froze. The connection simply refused to transmit. The screen displayed error transmission blocked. "What's happening?" one of them asked. Elliot stared at the blinking cursor. "I don't know. It's like something's jamming us." Moments later, the strange humming signal stopped. The radar went blank again. The next morning, Command sent out a notice to all coastal stations. It was short and strange. All communication activities regarding unidentified signals are to cease until further instruction. No public discussion permitted, that was it. No explanation. No follow-up. By then, the rumors had already started spreading among the staff. People whispered in the hallways about missing posts and scrambled frequencies. Some believed it was a secret military exercise. Others thought it was something far worse. Elliot tried to act normal, but sleep came less and less. Every night he returned to the console, listening for that signal again. And every night he felt it, something distant, heavy, and alive on the other end of the static. 3 days later, they finally got orders from command. A small investigation team would be sent to the island where the first SOS came from. Elliot immediately volunteered. He wanted answers. He wanted to see the place for himself. The journey to the island took a few hours by boat. The sky was gray, the sea rough. When they arrived, everything was quiet, too quiet. The island was small, covered in thick grass and black rock. The old outpost stood near the edge of a cliff, its walls cracked and weathered by salt and wind. There were no signs of life. The gates were open, the main door hanging loose. Inside, everything was covered in dust and sand. Old equipment lay broken across the floor. There were no footprints, no personal belongings, nothing that showed people had left recently. It looked like the place had been abandoned in a hurry. One of the men checked the power units. They were burnt out completely. Another tried to connect to the base's main computer, but it was fried. Elliot walked deeper inside, looking at the control panels. Some of them were melted as if they'd been exposed to intense heat. What could have done this? One of the men asked. Elliot shook his head. Not fire. Something else. He followed a trail of broken cables that led outside to the edge of the cliff. There he noticed strange marks on the ground, long, deep lines carved into the sand and rock, almost like something heavy had been dragged or burned through it. The air smelled faintly metallic, sharp and cold. "Captain," one of the men called. "You should see this." He turned. They had found a small metal case buried halfway under debris. Inside it was a data drive still intact. Elliot took it carefully. Maybe this was what they needed. The proof that the island hadn't just gone dark on its own. They packed up and prepared to leave. As they moved back toward the boat, Elliot looked one last time at the outpost. For a moment he thought he saw movement at one of the broken windows, a faint shadow, but when he looked again it was gone. The ride back to the mainland was silent. No one spoke. The captain radioed command, reporting that the island was deserted and unstable. They were told to hand over all recordings and devices immediately for security review. That night, Elliot sat alone in his quarters, thinking about what they had seen. His hands still smelled faintly like metal from the air on that island. Something had happened there, something command didn't want anyone to know about. When he went back to the communication room later that night, the same frequency light was blinking again. He hesitated, then slowly put on his headset. The static was faint at first, but then he heard a voice, a whisper, almost too soft to catch. "You're next." The signal ended. He sat there frozen, staring at the blinking light, his heartbeat loud in his ears. Outside, the sea was completely calm again, as if nothing had ever happened. But deep down, Elliot knew the quiet wouldn't last. Something was moving out there in the darkness, something that had already started its march. The days after the island visit passed slowly, but the unease around the base grew stronger. No one talked openly about what they'd seen, but everyone felt it. There was a quiet heaviness in the air, like the calm before something big and terrible. The command had taken all the recordings, the metal case, and even the data drive they'd found without giving any explanation. They told the team to rest and not discuss the mission. But the more Elliot tried to rest, the more his mind kept returning to that strange island. The burnt control panels, the deep marks in the sand, and that faint metallic smell that had clung to his clothes even after washing them. He couldn't stop thinking about the last thing he'd heard through his headset. "You're next." He wanted to tell someone, but who would believe him? Command already treated him like a man chasing ghosts, so he kept it to himself and focused on work, even though nothing about the work felt normal anymore. Each night he stayed in the control room long after his shift ended. He told others he was updating data, but really he was listening, waiting for that signal to come again. He had set up an extra receiver, one that wasn't linked to the base network, so command couldn't monitor it. He didn't know why he did it, only that he needed to know if the signal was still out there. And one night it came back. It was faint at first, soft static, then a single repeating tone. Then a voice far away whispering words that cut through the noise. "They're coming closer. Stay away from the water." Elliot's stomach tightened. He adjusted the frequency, trying to clean the sound, but the message faded as quickly as it came. The last few words were broken, almost lost in static. Not human. Run. He sat frozen, staring at the receiver. His hands were trembling slightly. The message had come from the same direction again, the sea near the abandoned island. But this time the signal strength was stronger. Whatever was out there was moving closer. The next morning he tried to raise the issue during briefing, but the commanding officer shut him down immediately. "No more talk about that," he said firmly. "We've had enough of your ghost signals." Elliot could tell that the officer wasn't just irritated, he was scared too. The man's eyes looked tired, his voice slightly shaky. He knew something was wrong, but was under strict orders to stay silent. That only made the whole situation feel worse. Later that evening, one of the technicians quietly approached Elliot. He was a quiet man who rarely spoke, but his voice was uneasy now. "You're not the only one hearing strange things," he said softly. "Last night we got another signal too, but it wasn't just audio. We caught a faint visual feed." Elliot's eyes widened. "A visual? From where?" "The same coordinates as the SOS. They went to the visual monitoring room, where the technician showed him the recorded feed. The screen was mostly static, but in the middle of the distortion, shapes could be seen. Black silhouettes, large and moving fast across the horizon. They didn't look like ships. They looked bigger, sharper, almost unnatural. The footage was only 6 seconds long before it cut out completely. Elliot felt his chest tighten. "Has anyone else seen this?" The technician shook his head. "No one. I saved it privately before the system could send it to command." Elliot nodded slowly. "Keep it hidden. Whatever this is, command doesn't want it getting out." That night he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those dark shapes moving silently through the static. The next day, things started to get worse. 3 more coastal posts went offline. At first, command claimed it was just maintenance, downtime. But then they quietly ordered all communication, lines to be tested for external interference. And that was the first time Elliot saw genuine fear on his commander's face. By evening, the coastal sky turned an unusual shade of gray. The wind picked up sharply and the ocean waves began to crash harder than usual. People around the base said it was just a storm, but Elliot wasn't sure. He went to the observation deck with binoculars, scanning the horizon. At first he saw nothing, but then far out over the water, he noticed faint flickering lights, the same kind he had seen nights ago. They were closer now. They weren't moving like boats or aircraft. They were gliding in perfect formation, silent, smooth, almost synchronized. He ran back inside to report what he saw, but the power flickered before he could say anything. The base went dark for a few seconds, then the lights came back on. The power loss wasn't long, but the brief silence during that blackout made everyone uneasy. When the systems restarted, one of the monitors flashed a strange message across the screen. "External link detected." Elliot leaned closer, but the message disappeared before he could read more. The commander ordered everyone to stay calm and keep working, but his own voice was shaking. Hours passed. The radar was empty again, but none of them trusted it anymore. The air felt too still, too quiet, as if the world itself was waiting for something. Later that night, a distress call came through. The sound was broken and filled with static, but they could still make out some of the words. "Station 9. Under attack. Power gone. Can't see them." The message cut off mid-sentence. Elliot and the others looked at each other, faces pale. Station 9 was less than 100 kilometers away. Command immediately sealed communication channels, ordering complete radio silence. They told everyone that the message was an error from damaged equipment. But no one believed it anymore. The next morning, the technician who had shown Elliot the visual feed didn't show up for duty. When Elliot went to look for him, his quarters were empty, and all his personal things were gone. Command said he had been reassigned to headquarters, but no one had seen him leave. Elliot tried to stay focused, but it was getting harder. He kept thinking about the missing people, the fading stations, the signals that kept returning from the same empty sea. That evening, he went back to the old receiver he had hidden. He turned it on quietly, adjusting the frequency again. For a long while, there was only static. Then suddenly he heard it, a deep rhythmic sound like something massive moving underwater. The sound grew louder, almost like breathing. Then came the voice. It was the same broken one from before, faint, tired, almost human, but not quite. "They're marching now. The fleet has moved." Elliot's chest tightened. "Who are you?" he whispered, though he knew they couldn't hear him. The voice continued, almost whispering directly into his ear. "We tried to stop them, but they took everything. The water hides them." The sound ended with a burst of static and then silence. Elliot sat there, frozen, staring at the receiver. He felt a chill go down his spine. He knew now. The signals weren't random. The warnings were real. Whatever was out there, it was moving toward them. He went straight to the commander again, demanding they take action. But before he could even finish explaining, the man slammed his hand on the desk. "Enough," he said sharply. "Do you think you're the first one to see this? You think we don't know? We've been told to keep quiet until further notice." "That's the order." Elliot was stunned. "Then it's true," he said softly. "You've seen the footage, haven't you?" The commander looked away. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Go back to your post." "That's an order." Elliot left, but deep down he knew the truth. The command was scared. Scared enough to hide whatever was coming. That night he returned to the balcony overlooking the ocean. The waves crashed below, darker than he had ever seen them. In the distance, faint flashes of light flickered again, low on the horizon. They looked closer than before, spreading slowly, one after another, like a long line of silent beacons stretching across the sea. He stood there for a long time, the wind cold against his face. The message echoed in his head. They're marching now. He didn't sleep that night. He just sat by the window, listening to the faint hum of the sea and the soft static from his receiver. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, something was moving, and whatever it was getting closer with every passing hour. And though he didn't know when or how it would reach them, he knew one thing for certain. The first warning hadn't been the last. The day began with a kind of stillness that didn't feel right. The air along the coast was heavy, and the sea had an unusual calm to it, as if the world was holding its breath. At the monitoring base, everyone could sense that something was about to happen, even though no one could explain why. Elliot stood near the radar screens, his eyes scanning the faint lines and dots that flickered across them. He had been doing this for weeks, sleeping only a few hours at a time, trying to make sense of the strange signals and the stories spreading between stations. But this time what he saw made his stomach tighten. Far beyond the regular patrol zones, the radar was picking up something enormous, hundreds of objects moving fast and in perfect formation. He stared for a long time, hoping it was an error. He adjusted the sensors, switched frequencies, and recalibrated the radar. But the results stayed the same. The formation was real, and it was heading toward the mainland. He called out to his superior officer, his voice unsteady. Within minutes, the command center was filled with tension. Orders were shouted, phones rang nonstop, and technicians rushed to confirm the data. No one could say who or what was out there, only that the scale of the movement was unlike anything seen before. The officer in charge finally said in a low voice, "Lock down the base. Alert every post within range. We're not taking chances." By evening, the entire coast was on high alert. Trucks carrying supplies roared through the narrow roads. Soldiers filled the shoreline, building barricades and setting up defense systems. The once quiet coastal town nearby became a place of noise and fear. Families gathered their things in panic, waiting for evacuation orders that kept getting delayed. People asked questions, but no one had answers. Rumors spread faster than the wind. Some said it was a fleet from another nation. Others whispered about secret weapons. But those who had heard the SOS message days ago knew this wasn't just a normal military threat. Elliot watched the scene unfold from the top of the communications tower. The sun dipped into the sea, painting the sky in deep red and orange. It looked beautiful and terrifying at the same time. He couldn't help but remember the voice from the old recording. "They're coming. Warn everyone." It echoed in his mind over and over. He turned his radio dial and tried to listen for that frequency again, the one that had started all of this. For a few moments there was only static. Then faintly he heard something like a whisper, then a sharp crack of sound, and finally a broken sentence that made his heart stop. The same voice spoke again, only this time it sounded even weaker. "They're close. It's too late." As night fell, the soldiers gathered near the observation deck. Everyone faced the ocean. The sea was dark and quiet, but in the distance a strange glow began to form. Soft at first, then brighter, spreading like a line across the horizon. It wasn't the glow of city lights or ships. It was something else, something unnatural. The surface of the water shimmered as if it were alive. Elliot felt a chill run down his spine. The commander shouted orders to prepare all defense systems, but deep down, no one was sure what they were preparing for. Minutes passed like hours. Then one by one, the radar screens went black. The communication channels filled with static. Satellites stopped responding. It was as if the sky itself had been cut off from them. In that eerie silence, the glow on the horizon grew stronger until the sea seemed to burn with light. Elliot turned his handheld receiver to full power, desperate to find any working frequency. That's when he heard it again, the same signal from before, the same repeating words that haunted him. The transmission was broken and full of interference, but the message was clear enough. "We tried to warn you." The soldiers looked at one another, unsure whether to run or stand their ground. The commander ordered everyone to remain calm, but his voice shook slightly. The glow now revealed dark, moving shapes, massive and smooth, gliding across the water in perfect lines. They didn't make a sound. No engines, no waves, nothing. Just motion. Some thought they were ships, others said they looked like shadows made solid. Whatever they were heading straight for the coast. Elliot backed away from the glass window, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He could see lights flickering across the town below. Families leaving their homes, car headlights forming long trails through the narrow roads. The noise of panic rose in the distance. He turned to his colleague, whispering, "This is the fleet from the signal. It has to be." His colleague didn't respond, just stared blankly at the sea as if hypnotized. Suddenly, a loud metallic hum filled the air. Every metal object in the room began to vibrate. The computers flickered violently, then died. The emergency lights turned red. The commander's voice echoed through the intercom. "Brace for impact." Outside, the first line of defense weapons activated, sending flashes into the darkness. But no one could tell if they were hitting anything. The air felt thicker, charged with static. The soldiers at the barricades shouted over the noise, their words lost in the growing roar from the ocean. Elliot ducked under a console as a window shattered, showering glass across the floor. He felt a wave of pressure push through the room, so powerful that it made the walls creak. Then, as quickly as it began, everything stopped. The humming faded. The lights flickered once and went out. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Elliot slowly stood up, breathing hard. The glow outside had vanished, replaced by complete darkness. He picked up his small flashlight and pointed it at the wall clock. The hands had stopped moving. Every electronic device in the room was dead. He stepped outside, careful not to trip over the debris. The cold night air hit his face. The sea was invisible now, swallowed by the darkness. He could barely make out the outlines of the defensive structures. Soldiers were moving in confusion, calling to each other, their voices tense. No one knew if the threat was still coming or if it had already passed. From somewhere behind him, a radio crackled weakly to life. Elliot ran toward the sound and found the old emergency receiver still working. It hissed and buzzed, but through the noise he could hear faint words repeating, "We tried to warn you." He froze. The voice wasn't distant this time. It was coming from inside the base frequency itself, as if it were being replayed through their own system. He turned the volume down and looked around. A few soldiers stood near him, pale and shaken. "What does it mean?" one of them asked quietly. Elliot didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth was, he didn't know what any of it meant. The night dragged on endlessly. No one slept. They waited, staring at the dark ocean, expecting another wave of light or another signal. But nothing came. The sea stayed quiet. Only the wind moved through the broken windows and empty hallways. Around dawn, when the first faint light touched the sky, Elliot saw the coastline clearly again. The barricades were still there, but many of the metal surfaces had strange marks. Thin, glowing lines that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The soldiers kept their distance, afraid to touch them. Elliot walked to the water's edge. The waves were gentle again, as if nothing had happened. But on the sand he saw something metallic half buried, smooth, round, and cold. It looked like a piece of some unknown machine. He bent down and brushed off the sand. It was light in weight but felt powerful in his hands. He placed it carefully in a container and sealed it. When he returned to the base, the commander was speaking to headquarters through one of the few working communication lines. The connection was poor, but the words containment and classified could be heard clearly. Elliot understood what that meant. They were going to cover it up. No reports, no explanations. The world outside would never know what had just happened. That night, as he sat near the ruins of the radar tower, Elliot turned on his personal radio once more. The static filled the air, steady and soft. Then, just for a second, he thought he heard the voice again, whispering so quietly it almost blended with the wind. "They're still marching." He froze, waiting to hear it again. But the radio went silent. Only the faint sound of waves remained. He stayed there for a long time, staring at the horizon, knowing deep inside that whatever had appeared out there in the sea wasn't finished. It was only the beginning. The night was unusually dark, and the air felt heavier than ever. After the strange events of the previous day, the base was tense, silent, and chaotic all at once. People moved quickly but carefully, like they were walking on thin ice. No one wanted to speak more than necessary, and the atmosphere was thick with fear. Elliot had never felt anything like it before. Even the trained soldiers looked anxious, checking their weapons and scanning the horizon constantly. The ocean, which had seemed calm that morning, now carried a strange energy. The waves moved in ways that didn't feel natural, swelling slightly and then stopping, almost as if they were watching. From the top of the radar tower, Elliot could see the distant horizon, but there was no sign of the fleet. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that it was out there, waiting, watching. He returned to the communications room, checking the personal receiver he had hidden. The old frequency was dead. For hours, nothing came through except static. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted, rubbing his eyes. The previous nights had been long, filled with tension, and sleep had become impossible. Yet he knew the calm couldn't last. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered. The computers blinked, then all the monitors went black. Elliot felt a wave of panic hit him. His heart raced. Something was happening, something strong enough to affect the base's systems. A low metallic hum filled the air, vibrating through the floor. He pressed his hands to his ears and tried to steady his breathing. The soldiers outside shouted, their voices rising in fear. Elliot grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the observation deck. He wanted to see the horizon with his own eyes. The sea was still, but the glow returned, a faint, eerie shimmer spreading along the water. Then came the shapes. They were moving faster than anything he had seen before. Dark, massive forms gliding silently above the waves, perfectly synchronized, stretching in lines that seemed to go on forever. The soldiers fired warning flares, hoping to distract them, but the shapes didn't react. No sound came from the fleet except the hum that vibrated the base. Elliot felt the vibrations in his chest and his bones. The pressure was immense, like a force pushing down on everything at once. The commander shouted orders to engage, but even he sounded uncertain. "Prepare all systems. Activate everything," he barked, but the fear in his voice betrayed him. Elliot turned back to the control panels. None of the computers worked. The communication lines were dead. Even the emergency signals weren't responding. They were completely isolated. He realized then that the base's defenses would not work, not against whatever was coming. A soft, trembling voice came from the handheld receiver he kept at his side. Elliot grabbed it. Static filled the speaker, then a broken, almost human whisper. "Run. Do not stay. They are above." "The fleet is here," he froze. The words were faint, fragmented, but they carried urgency he couldn't ignore. He looked around at the soldiers nearby. Their faces were pale, terrified. Some were praying quietly. Others were frozen, unable to move. The hum grew louder. It wasn't just noise, it was a presence, a pressure, a weight that seemed to fill the air. Elliot felt his legs grow weak. He stumbled toward the emergency exit, signaling to a few soldiers to follow. Some ran, some stayed behind, paralyzed by fear. The base trembled. A wave of force seemed to push through the walls, rattling equipment and sending loose objects clattering across the floors. The wind outside howled, stronger than any storm he had ever experienced. Elliot and the group that followed him ran down the corridors toward the underground tunnels, hoping the structure would offer some protection. The commander stayed behind, shouting orders, trying to coordinate defenses that no longer functioned. His voice echoed through the halls, tense and uncertain, but the sounds were distant, almost muffled by the hum that now filled the base completely. Once in the tunnels, the group paused to catch their breath. Elliot's heart pounded so loudly he thought everyone could hear it. The walls were cold, damp, and uneven. The smell of metal and salt hung thick in the air. The group was small, no more than 10 people, but each one moved carefully, scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. From the surface came a low, rolling sound that shook the ground beneath their feet. Elliot looked back toward the stairwell leading to the observation deck. He could see faint lights through the cracks in the walls, the shimmer from the fleet reflecting off the walls and ceiling. It was beautiful, terrifying, and overwhelming all at once. Hours seemed to pass in silence. The underground tunnels offered shelter, but it wasn't safe. Elliot could hear distant noises from above, metal scraping, faint crashing, and what sounded like something sliding across the roof of the base. He pressed himself against the wall, feeling every vibration in the concrete beneath him. One of the soldiers whispered, "Are they leaving?" "Are they gone?" Elliot shook his head. "No. They're still out there, waiting, watching. This isn't over." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the tunnels. The group jumped, their lights shaking. Something had fallen above, but the sound was too deep, too heavy to be a normal object. Elliot signaled for everyone to move further into the tunnels, away from the stairwell and closer to the storage areas. They moved slowly, carefully. Every step echoed ominously. The metallic hum remained constant, vibrating through the walls and floors. Elliot could feel it in his chest, in his head, as if it were reaching into him. The others whispered quietly, afraid to make any sudden noise. Time became meaningless. Minutes stretched into hours. No one spoke except for occasional murmurs of fear. The air grew stale and thick, but it was better than the surface, which felt charged and dangerous. Finally, the hum began to fade slightly, though the tension remained. Elliot peeked through a small vent opening at the surface. The lights from the fleet had disappeared. The ocean was calm again, but he didn't trust it. He knew better than to assume that the silence meant safety. He looked at the others, their faces pale and drawn. Many had been in the tunnels for hours, too afraid to move. They were exhausted, scared, and unsure what to do next. Elliot realized that the fleet wasn't just a force. It was something beyond their understanding. Whatever had come, it wasn't human, and it didn't follow any rules they knew. As dawn approached, the group slowly moved back toward the central tunnel exit. The air outside was heavy and still. Elliot carefully climbed to the surface first. The coastline looked untouched, eerily normal, but the strange metallic residue scattered along the shore told a different story. Pieces of equipment were bent, twisted, and scorched. The waves lapped gently at objects that had washed up overnight. It looked peaceful, but Elliot knew it wasn't. The soldiers followed cautiously. They checked the barricades, the observation towers, and the main entrances. Everything was silent. The glow from the fleet was gone, the hum had vanished, and even the strange shadows that had moved across the horizon were nowhere to be seen. But something remained. Something intangible. The feeling that the fleet had been there, that it had touched everything, lingered. The air felt heavy with it, and even the wind seemed cautious, whispering through the broken walls as if it were carrying a warning. Elliot picked up a piece of the metallic debris from the shore. It was smooth, light, but surprisingly hard. He examined it carefully, feeling the faint vibration it gave off in his hand. It wasn't anything he had seen before, nor could he imagine what it was part of. He carefully placed it in a secure container, knowing this might be the only evidence of what had truly happened. The commander finally gathered the group. He spoke quietly, his voice heavy with relief and fear. "We survived the night," he said, "but don't mistake this for the end. Whatever it was out there, it isn't done. We have to be ready for what comes next." Elliot nodded silently. He knew the commander was right. The fleet had come, it had moved through their waters, and though it had vanished for now, its presence lingered. The warnings, the signals, the strange voices, they weren't random. They were signs. Signs of something that was marching, moving closer and waiting for the right moment. That night, Elliot stayed awake again. He sat by the shore listening to the gentle waves, but his mind replayed everything he had seen. The hum, the shadows, the whispers, the metallic residue. Even though the ocean seemed calm, he could feel it. The tension, the weight, the anticipation. The fleet might be gone for now, but it had left its mark, and Elliot knew that what they had experienced was only the beginning. The morning after, the strange events passed slowly, almost too slowly. The sun rose over the horizon, but its light did little to warm the air. Everything on the coast looked peaceful, almost normal, but the unease lingered. Elliot walked along the shoreline, the metallic debris from the previous night still scattered in small piles along the sand. He picked up another piece, small and smooth, feeling the faint vibration that seemed to hum from within. It was impossible to understand what it was, but he knew one thing. This was proof that the fleet had been here, and it was something far beyond their world. The base was quiet, yet the tension was unbearable. Soldiers and staff moved silently, checking equipment and observing the horizon. No one spoke more than necessary. Everyone felt the same truth in their hearts. The fleet was still out there waiting, and it could return at any moment. Elliot went to the command center to meet with the commander. The commander sat at the large table, papers and devices scattered around him. He looked exhausted, his face drawn and pale. "We survived last night," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean we're safe. The fleet, it didn't attack us in full. It tested us, observed us. They're learning, and we have to be ready for what comes next." Elliot nodded. "I think the warnings, the signals, they were trying to tell us something. They weren't random." The commander looked at him sharply. "We don't have the luxury of assuming. We prepare, we observe, and we follow orders. No assumptions, no mistakes." Elliot left the room with a heavy feeling in his chest. He couldn't shake the memory of the whispers from the receiver. "We tried to warn you. They're still marching." Those words kept echoing in his mind. By midday, the base had organized teams to check the surrounding coastline. They were looking for more debris, any signs of the fleet's passage. Elliot joined one of the teams, walking along cliffs and small coves. The sand was littered with metal fragments, many embedded with strange patterns, glowing faintly in certain lights. None of the pieces matched anything they had seen before. While examining the shoreline, Elliot noticed faint marks on the rocks, deep grooves carved into the stone that hadn't been there before. They ran in straight, sharp lines leading toward the water. It was as if something massive had moved along the coast with precision and force, leaving behind these strange tracks. He knelt down, tracing one with his hand. The grooves were warm, pulsing faintly. He stood quickly, sensing movement behind him. The team remained silent, all eyes scanning the cliffs. No one spoke, but the tension was visible in their posture. Elliot knew better than to speak too loudly. Whatever had left these marks could still be out there. Later, as the sun began to set, a new signal came through the hidden receiver Elliot had kept. The hum returned, soft at first, almost soothing, then rising into a high-pitched vibration. Through the static, a voice emerged, clearer this time. "They are moving inland. They will not stop. You must prepare." Elliot's stomach tightened. He called over one of his colleagues, showing the recording. The man listened in disbelief, his face growing pale. How is this possible?" "There's no way they're transmitting this from the sea. The base would have blocked it." Elliot shook his head. "I don't know. But it's real. And it's warning us. We can't ignore it." The night brought darkness and fear once again. The base had lit searchlights scanning the horizon, but nothing could be seen. The ocean was calm, almost unnaturally still. Yet Elliot knew the fleet was out there. The whispers from the signal had prepared him to expect the unexpected. Around midnight, the first signs of movement appeared. The lights flickered in the distance far beyond the horizon. Then came shapes, long, dark, massive silhouettes gliding silently over the water, forming lines and arcs. They didn't look like ships or submarines. They looked alive, moving as if controlled by a single mind. Elliot grabbed the handheld receiver. Through the static, the voice returned, this time urgent. "They are here. Protect yourself. Protect the others." The command center was in chaos. Soldiers moved quickly, setting up defensive measures, though everyone knew their systems had been compromised before. Nothing they had could match the fleet's movement. Elliot watched the horizon, feeling a combination of fear and awe. Hours passed. The fleet didn't attack directly, but hovered, moving slowly and deliberately. The strange glowing lines on the water spread, pulsing rhythmically, almost like they were signaling something. Elliot realized that the fleet was observing the base, studying every movement, every response. It wasn't destruction they sought tonight, it was understanding. By morning, the fleet began to recede, returning to the sea. It was slow, almost ceremonial, leaving behind only traces in the water, debris scattered along the shore, and the strange glowing marks on the sand and rocks. The calm returned, but it felt false. Elliot knew that the fleet's visit was temporary. They would be back. Command issued a quiet statement. The base was stable, and the threat had passed for now. But Elliot and the team knew better. The warnings from the signals, the whispers, the shapes on the water, they all confirmed one truth. this was not the end. In the following days, Elliot worked tirelessly to document every piece of debris, every signal and every mark left by the fleet. He created detailed maps of the coastline, recording the strange grooves in the rock and sand, noting every fragment of metal that had washed ashore. The commander allowed him to work mostly independently, trusting his instincts but unwilling to share all the information with the outside world. Late one night, Elliot stayed at the observation tower alone, scanning the horizon. The sea was calm, the wind soft, but the tension never left him. He thought about the signals, the whispers, the warnings. He realized that whatever was out there wasn't just a fleet. It was a force with intelligence, patience, and intent. It had tested them, observed them, and left, but it would return. The next morning, a faint ripple in the ocean caught his attention. He grabbed his binoculars. In the distance, shapes moved just beneath the surface, too large to be natural. The water shimmered strangely over them, reflecting light in impossible ways. Elliot's heart raced. The fleet had returned, not in full force, but enough to remind him that nothing had ended. He returned to the base, his mind racing. The commander met him at the entrance. "You've seen it again," he said quietly, almost as if speaking the truth aloud was dangerous. "Yes," Elliot replied. "They're still out there. And next time they won't just observe." The commander nodded. "We need to prepare. Differently this time. Learn everything we can. Protect the people and hope we're ready when they come fully." Elliot spent the next days coordinating with his team to strengthen the base, improve defenses, and record every signal that came through the hidden receiver. Each transmission brought more understanding, though it also brought fear. The messages were fragmented but consistent. The fleet was intelligent, deliberate, and patient. They were moving, marching toward human settlements in ways no one had predicted. One night, Elliot listened to the receiver for hours. The static seemed louder, more intense. Then the familiar voice came through, softer than before but clear. "You will see them fully soon. Prepare, survive, warn others." Elliot sat back, exhausted but determined. He understood now that survival wasn't about fighting. It was about observation, learning, and sharing the warnings. The SOS had come to warn them months ago, and now he was part of that chain. He had to be ready for the next encounter. Weeks passed. The fleet never attacked directly again, but maintained its presence near the coast. The signs, the debris, the signals, they all continued. Elliot worked tirelessly, documenting everything and training the soldiers to recognize the signs of the fleet's movements. The base became a quiet hub of preparation, awareness, and cautious observation. Elliot often returned to the shoreline at night, staring at the water and listening to the wind. Sometimes faint hums or static-filled whispers came from his receiver. Each time he felt the same chill in his chest. The fleet was patient, waiting for the right moment. He realized then that the SOS they had received months ago was not just a warning, it was a message of survival. They had been given a chance to prepare, and Elliot knew that every observation, every record, every scrap of debris mattered. The fleet's march was inevitable, but humans had a chance to endure it if they listened, learned, and stayed vigilant. As the sun set over the horizon one evening, Elliot stood alone at the shoreline. The sea shimmered faintly under the orange light, calm yet alive. The whispers in his receiver were quiet now, but he knew they hadn't gone. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the fleet was still moving, still watching, and still marching. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility. The SOS had been received and the warnings had been heard. The world had been given a chance. Elliot knew that the march of the fleet was far from over, but now humanity was awake, aware, and ready to meet it. And though fear remained, he felt a spark of determination ignite within him. Survival was no longer passive. It was a choice. The sea stretched endlessly before him, dark and mysterious, and Elliot whispered quietly to himself, "We've been warned. We'll be ready,